Good evening. I really don't need to introduce William because many of you know him and have seen him for the past few years. But I do want to sort of share two stories that I heard earlier today. So the first one was a lady came up to me and said, "You know, I met William when he was shy and thin as a stick." And I'm going, really? When would that have been? And the second was I was sitting at the back in the last session, and my seat person said, this is the session that I've been really waiting for. And I could hear him read a telephone book and I wouldn't stir. So William Dalrymple, at the age of 18, I think, washed up on the shores of India, like most of these Scottish third or fourth sons tend to do. And thereafter, he fell in love with India, and he sort of turned out a whole series of wonderful novels on Mughal India, primarily, leading up to this tome, which actually puts it all together into one dynamic story. I don't know if any of you have actually been able to pick up the book. You could do away with your weight training and just use two of the books. So you could buy two books at the same time and it could solve both the problems. So ladies and gentlemen, the way this session will work is Willie is going to do a presentation which will take you through part of the book, and then he and I will have a little conversation about all the bad things that the East India Company were up to. And then we will open it up to all of you in the house, and we will lead straight from there into the closing session with some great poetry from Jovan and a young person who was with us yesterday. So please welcome William Dalrymple.
Since Sanjoy's been letting out family secrets, it's only fair that I come back. And I don't know how many of you are Asterix readers, but it's a little-known secret that Goskin and Urzaro based the character of the musician Cacophonix, the bard who is always being tied up with the long grey hair, on Sanjoy. And we have yet to have him tied up at Jaipur, but the moment will come, I'm sure, before... Anyway. One of the very first words of Hindi or Urdu or Hindustani to enter the English language was the word loot. Loot is from the Urdu lutna, to plunder. And it was a word rarely heard outside the plains of North India before the 18th century, when it suddenly became a word in common usage in English. And as good a place as any to see how this happened would be to visit this wonderful castle, craggy castle on the right here. For this is Powis Castle, built originally for a Welsh prince that the English had just dethroned, and it was a sop to him having lost his kingdom. They built this castle. But the main plunder and items of appropriation date from a later period of English perfidy. Because Powis Castle, the home of the Clive dynasty, contains more Mughal loot than any single collection in India, including the National Museum in Delhi. Sitting in this isolated castle between England and Wales, beautifully displayed, it has to be said, and gorgeously lit and displayed by the National Trust, are whole treasure troves of incredibly valuable hookahs, swords, shields, elephant armor, Hindu statuary, the palanquin of the deposed Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla is in the foreground here. A little bit down the corridor, if you turn to the left, you'll find the campaign tent of Tipu Sultan, and so on, and so on. And Powis is, I think, exceptionally rich in this material, but it's not by any means unique. Across the British Isles, I'm a Scot and like to dissociate myself from most acts of English perfidy, but it is sadly the case that my nationals too were every bit as guilty in this particular story. Across Scotland, England and Wales, you will find large, gorgeous 18th century houses, many of them now open to the public, and people will spend their weekends and have teas in the tea houses and take away a postcard or whatever they do in the weekend. And they will see in room after room Indian furniture, Indian armor, Indian jewelry, Indian paintings. And to explain how many of these got here, you need only walk to the entrance of the Powis treasure trove, where this picture is displayed. It's not a very good picture, but it's a very revealing one. Because what it shows is a slightly effete Mughal prince. Could we have maybe the lights down? Is there a technical person here that can turn the lights down so we can see the images slightly better? Thank you. And an effete Mughal emperor is handing to a red-coated, slightly overweight, powdered and periwigged Georgian gentleman a scroll. On the right stands the emperor's Mughal bodyguard. On the left stand the troops and the nobility of the East India Company. And what is happening here is what we might today call an act of involuntary privatization. The technical term is the Diwani, but that means nothing to anyone, either here or in India. And what had happened, the background to this picture, was an event in 1765 when the Mughal emperor, having been defeated by the armies of the East India Company, was encouraged, shall we say, to hand over to the company the powers of raising taxes, minting coins, and running the finances of the three richest provinces of the Mughal Empire. Now, just to give you a bit of context here, at this point, Britain was producing about 3% of world GDP, while India was producing about 35%. Mughal India. Mughal India being not just today's India, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh, and half of Afghanistan. And this area was undergoing, at this period, a period of exceptional industrial growth. Touched on, any of you that was on the earlier session of the Empire of Cotton. For this was a period when Indian textiles were sought all over the world. Incredibly fine cotton, which Sven was talking about, but also silks, chintzes, and the indigo to dye them, was being produced, particularly in Bengal, by 1 million Bengali weavers. Enough textiles to flood the distant markets of Mexico. You get deindustrialization in Mexico in the 18th century for the sheer quantity of Indian cotton being imported there. And in India today, people still talk about the British conquering India. And in England and Britain too, this phrase is used. But the reality is actually much more sinister. Because it wasn't the British government per se that conquered India. It was a private company, headquartered not out of Downing Street, but out of one small office, 5 windows wide. It's not even the 2 wings on either side of that building. It's just the central block that was the East India Company. A century into its existence, it only had a staff of 35 people in its head office. Yet that skeleton staff pulled off what was effectively the greatest corporate takeover in history. The takeover not of another company, but of an entire sovereign empire. And this process took a remarkably short period of time. The first serious conquests are made in 1757. It's pretty well all over by 1803, just 50 years later, when the armies of Lord Lake march into Delhi and effectively end the sovereign power of the Mughal Empire. How on earth did this happen? How could one company take over what was, at the time, the richest country in the world. This is the 18th century, just again to give a bit of context, was the one period in history when India actually overtakes China in terms of exports and productivity. And for about 80 years, between the end of the 17th and the mid-18th century, India is producing more exports than China. And yet, at the end of this process, one English company takes it over. I spent the last 6 years researching this and trying to answer that question. How on earth did this happen? And I hope over the next 40 minutes, I'll be able to give you some idea or some ideas of how this was possible. Let's start at the beginning. The story opens on the 24th of September, 1599. South of the Thames, in Southwark, William Shakespeare is working on Hamlet, which is produced at the end of that year for the first time. About 20 minutes walk through London, north from Southwark. If you'd walked that on this 24th September 1599, you would have entered a large half-timbered Tudor building in Moorgate Fields, on the edge of the city of London. And there a public meeting had been called by this man, Thomas Smythe, known as Customer Smythe or Auditor Smythe. His story, he was a self-made man. He'd made a fortune importing currants from the Greek islands and spices from the Middle East. He'd formed an earlier company with a small group of cronies, 50 rich merchants, called the Levant Company. And he'd made a fortune with the trade on particularly with Aleppo and the spices coming in from through the Middle East into Aleppo and the Syrian coast. He'd then risen to be auditor of the City of London. He was one of the big early capitalists. And it was he who called this public meeting because his business was in crisis and he needed to raise a huge sum of capital. His easy trade with the Middle East was interrupted when the Dutch pulled a fast one and decided to sail directly round the Cape of Good Hope to the Indonesian Spice Islands, particularly an island called Run that produced nutmeg, which was then in great demand, and immediately undercut Customer Smythe's business in the Middle East because they could bring back to Europe spices that were purer and infinitely cheaper, bought direct from the original producers the other side of the world. So Customer Smythe calls this meeting because he wants to form a new type of company. Not like the Levant Company, a company where a bunch of other merchants come together in a guild system, but something called a joint stock company. And this was a crucial new Tudor invention. It wasn't the first. There'd been an earlier joint stock called the Muscovy Company, which was designed to trade with Moscow. There'd been another one involved in the slave trade with Sierra Leone. But the East India Company was probably the world's fourth joint stock company. And what was special about it was this. As well as the merchants and the rich, the Lord Mayor, Sir John Soane, and all these characters, invited to this meeting were people who signed their names as they entered, or the notaries wrote down their names, haberdashers, vintners, skinners, grocers, ordinary small-scale businessmen who would give £5 or £10, who wouldn't expect to be part of the running of the company, but who would, by investing, get a share of the profits. And this was a radically new type of operation. Up to this point, everywhere in the world, companies were either family companies. The Medici Bank was a family bank. Marco Polo, going to China with his father and uncle, was a family business. But this was a corporation, one of the very first corporations. And by opening up investment to anyone who had a spare fiver or 10 quid or 20 quid, as well as the merchants who, are, as you see in the figures on the right, are investing £1,000 or £200, you opened yourself up to hugely greater potential of capital investment. And with this brand new business invention, the world was changed very substantially. Today, most people work for corporations. They are an incredibly powerful institution and an important idea that has, in many ways, a very positive thing that has generated huge quantities of wealth for hundreds of years. But as the East India Company's history show, they are also institutions which have their own driving force. They exist to make profit for their investors. And they are, just like a human being has a series of primary urges to feed, to breed, to pass on the genes, so the corporation has this driving urge to make more and more profits and to bend laws and change the world around it in order to make this happen. And the story of the East India Company is the story of a business which grew from a small, haphazard group of Londoners pooling their capital to buy spices to the most powerful business organization in history. At its peak, the East India Company had its own private army that was twice the size of the British Army. It built half the docks in London. It planted opium in Bihar, which it narco-traded in the largest drug operation in history, to China. In China, it bought tea, and it was East India Company tea that ultimately gets dumped in Boston Harbor. So this is an entirely global business with its own powerful driving force that often comes into conflict with the power of the state. Not only the states where it's trading, the states in India in this case, but also the home government. So in 1697, less than a century after its founding, the East India Company has the world's first lobbying scandal, when it is found to be offering its shares to members of parliament in order to encourage them to extend its monopoly. And in the end of an investigation, it's found they've given bribes of its own shares to many parliamentarians, and the governor of the East India Company goes to the Tower of London, as does the Lord Privy Councillor. But this whole world that we have today of giant corporations like ExxonMobil, who have contracted 20 senators today in Washington, this minute, 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats, so that whoever's in power, they can control and mold and influence government policy. This begins with this company. This is a new moment in world history, and this is where it begins. So this is the man who leads the first expedition. His name is Sir John Lancaster. He had been east before, but failed to bring his ship back. He shipwrecked in the Moluccas, lost many of his crew members to various mishaps. He made it back, and it was into his hands that this expedition was made. The first thing they do is they go and buy some ships with their money. They reject a creaky old hulk called the Mayflower that's sitting in the harbor. I don't know what happened to that. And instead they buy a pirate ship because Elizabethan England was making a lot of money at this point by officially raiding. They gave out permits to raid Portuguese and Spanish treasure ships coming back from the New World. And captains like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh were given privateering certificates by the Queen to go and perform what we today would call a form of state-sanctioned crime. The oligarchs of Charing Cross would sail off, raid a few Portuguese vessels, bring it back. And the first vessel they buy is one of these, and it's called the Scourge of Malice. Some bright spark points out this may not be giving quite the right message, and so they rename it the Red Dragon, as if it's a country pub in a Welsh village or something. Anyway, off it sails, the Red Dragon, with Sir James Lancaster in the way, and they have a terrible humiliation because they get out just beyond Dover when the wind drops, and for a whole month they sit about 1 mile off the coast of Dover, becalmed, and everyone's laughing at them from the banks. But anyway, the wind picks up, they go off, and they do get to the East Indies, and they do come back with a whole galleon full of spices, again, typically not actually traded, but actually taken from a Portuguese galleon that they met en route. So the East India Company charter authorizes it to wage war. And this is what it does from day one. But it isn't until much later that it actually becomes an imperial force, what later Edmund Burke calls a state in the guise of a merchant. And during the 17th century, as the Mughal Empire is at its peak, they content themselves with slowly giving way to the Dutch with the spice trade. The Dutch are given, at the end of a long series of battles for which the English come out worse, they decide to give over the spice trade to the Dutch, and famously, in one of the better deals in East India Company history, they swap the spice island of Run in Indonesia for some muddy island in the Hudson River called Manhattan. And so they, having given up on the spice trade, they then focus on the textile trade. And this is very good timing because, as I said, this is the moment when India is producing more fine quality textiles than ever before. And it is the East India Company that is the shipper of these Indian exports, not only to Europe but also to the New World. And they make a lot of money from this. And they build up a series of small forts which become cities on the coast of India, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. And they more or less peaceably continue this trade through to the 1750s. But then something very important happened. This is the growing East India Company house. This is its first incarnation on Leadenhall Street. Here's the company ships being built in Deptford. And this is the early Mughal Empire. This is Akbar debating religious matters with Jesuits, rather than in England, where if you were a Jesuit, you would get hung, drawn, and quartered. In India, Akbar debates with them, and he debates with Sunni and Shia, Shaivite and Vaishnav, in order, he says, to distinguish the firm ground of reason from the marshy land of tradition. So this premium on reason, which Europeans always imagined was an 18th century European invention, but which is alive and well and at a premium in Mughal India. Anyway, the Mughal Empire reaches its territorial peak with this man, the Emperor Aurangzeb. But his overstretch, his overly ambitious conquest of two Deccan sultanates, Bijapur and Golconda, and his bigotry to his Rajput Hindu crack troops who he taxes as Hindus, and this begins to fracture the multi-religious framework of the empire, leads to the empire cracking. And Delhi is left the richest city between Istanbul and Tokyo, but increasingly vulnerable as more and more of the subject peoples in the empire rise up in revolts. The Sikhs, the Marathas, the Jats, even as close to Agra. And this magnificent city looks more and more inviting until eventually this man comes down and pulls it off the tree like a ripe mango, as he says, I'm going to India to pluck some golden feathers from the Mughal peacock's tail. And this man is Nadir Shah, humble son of a farrier who rises through his own incredible military abilities to the top of the Persian army. He overthrows the old Safavid dynasty who'd built Isfahan, and then invades India. And with him, he takes his new gizmo, which is something called a swivel gun. It's like an anti-tank, it's like an early tank gun, a huge, thick jezail mounted on a horse's bridle with a sort of tripod system. And this thing can pierce any Mughal armor. And so when he attacks India, all the different Mughal governors gather. 1.5 million people fill the Mughal military camp at Karnal, and Nadir Shah lures them out of their entrenchments. And there's this magnificent charge in 1739 with about 3-mile-long line of Mughal cavalry in heavy armor into a trot, into a canter, and finally into a full gallop. And at the last minute, the Persian cavalry part like a curtain, and there are the swivel guns sitting beyond them. 5 minutes later, it's all over. The cream of Mughal chivalry lies dead on the ground, on the plain of Karnal, north of Delhi. And that evening, Nadir Shah invites the Mughal Emperor, Muhammad Shah Rangila, to dinner. Muhammad Shah accepts the invitation, idiotically, and after dinner, his own bodyguard is disarmed and he is captured. So they march into Delhi together, and 6 weeks later, Nadir Shah leaves for Persia with the peacock throne into which is embedded the Kohinoor and the Timur ruby, the two most valuable diamonds in the world, along with 8,000 wagons filled with jewelry and plunder. Everything the Mughals had plundered from India over the previous 2 centuries is loaded into carts and taken off to the Afghan-Persian border. And after this, it's as if the boiler house of the Mughal Empire has just run out of fuel. There's no more coal to heat the Mughal boiler, if you like. And in the next few years, it's literally as if someone's thrown a mirror out of a first-floor window and the whole of Mughal India shatters and fragments into 1,000 glittering pieces. And these small glittering pieces, the Sikh Empire in the Punjab, the Jat Empire in the Doab, a whole variety of little Pahari states in the hills, the Marathas out of Pune, and so on, are small, weak, rich, and easily hoovered up by 2 new powers on the Indian coast, which is the English East India Company and their rivals, the French. And it is the rivalry between the English and the French that allows the East India Company to wheedle Parliament into using state troops and state funds to protect its investments in India. So using the bogeyman of France, the East India Company gets, for the first time in 1756, a fleet sent out to protect Madras and Calcutta because they believe that Calcutta is going to be attacked by the French. The French have begun this process of training up these rather natty-looking chaps who are the first sepoys. Look at their very sort of fetching shorts. The sepoy is... What has happened in 18th century Europe is that Frederick the Great of Prussia has developed a whole series of new infantry techniques, socket bayonets, elevating screws on the back of artillery, the idea of fighting in squares and file firing so that one group of infantry fire kneeling, then the next lot come forward and fire standing, so you get a continual roll of fire. These techniques, though not rocket science, revolutionize warfare. And this military revolution is exported to India, and the French begin training up local Indian warriors in these new techniques. And for about 20 years, the sepoys of the 2 companies can defeat any Indian army. It takes India 20 years only to catch up with this technology. But for that time, there is this crucial military advantage. And then in 1756, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the new sort of punk Nawab of Bengal, his grandfather had been this elegant old man called Aliverdi Khan, who compared the East India Company to a hive of bees. He says, if you treat them well, you can take their honey, but if you kick their hive, you get stung. Anyway, Siraj-ud-Dowlah ignores this advice. And when he hears the company has rebuilt its fortifications in Calcutta without his permission, he attacks Calcutta, captures it, and puts the survivors into something called what later English schoolboys learn as the Black Hole of Calcutta. In fact, only about 40 people are killed in that prison by suffocation. But this is a kind of casus belli after this. The British want to avenge their dead, and for once, they've got a Royal Navy marine fleet sitting in Madras waiting to take on the French, not the Bengalis. But by pure good fortune for the company, it's arrived just at the right time, and they send that up, and they attack Siraj-ud-Dowlah. They attack Calcutta, they get it back again. Then they attack the French in Chandanagar, and they wipe out the French in India. And they're about to go back to Madras in case the French turn up again, when something crucial happens. And this is a very important part of the story. An envoy arrives from the richest banker in Bengal, who's a man called the Jagat Seth. Now, the Jagat Sets are Oswal Marwari Jains, and they are the great moneylenders to the Mughal Empire. And they've built up a fortune transmitting tribute from the provincial governors to Delhi and taking a cut on the way. They also run the mints, and the Jagat Set, who's the richest of all of them, is richer even than the Rothschilds in Paris. He's an incredible figure, and he is irritated by Siraj ud-Dowlah, who has threatened to circumcise him unless he delivers a loan that he doesn't want to give. And so Jagat Set merely sends a note to Clive saying, come and depose this terrible Nawab, and I will give you personally £2 million, and I will give the company 20 million. Now, these are vast sums of money by 18th century standards. So Clive has no difficulty at all making a decision that he'll go and do this. And the man they're going to put on the throne that the Jagat Sets have set up is a slightly elderly, dim Arab general called Mir Jafar. And Mir Jafar, during the crucial Battle of Plassey, marches away, leaving Siraj ud-Dowlah's army undefended. And Clive goes and claims the victory, and shortly afterwards claims the £2 million reward that makes him overnight the richest citizen, the richest self-made man in Europe. Now, behind this lies an increasing realization among the bankers of India that they speak the same language as the company. They're both financiers. The company may plunder, it may be ruthless, it may speak a different tongue and hold a different religion and have different customs, but it understands the importance of repaying loans with interest on time, enforcing contracts in a court of law, and so on. And the bankers, not just the Jagat Sets, but many of the other bankers, particularly in Bengal and Benares, consistently favor the company over their Indian rivals, allowing the company to pull off this extraordinary coup. There are never more than 2,000 British factors of the company in India. Yet these 2,000 traders borrow money from Indian bankers to pay for Indian mercenaries to fight other Indian armies. And through this process of 20 years of military superiority, plus maintaining cordial relations with the banking classes, they pull off this extraordinary and unlikely succession of victories. First Plassey, and then this is Robert Clive, who's the kind of incredibly mentally unstable, violent, psycho commander of the company. As a boy, he was a kind of village delinquent who threatened to throw stones through people's windows unless they paid him. He had sort of protection rackets running in Shropshire. His parents, understandably, ship him off to India to get rid of him. Then he hates India, makes no effort to learn any Indian languages or have any fondness for anything. His letters contain not one reference to the beauty of Indian architecture or lovely landscapes or anything that any normal tourist would record on arrival. But he is very effective. He has this strange ability, the street fighter's ability, to size up an opponent. And in 18th century India, where warfare is a matter of chivalry and diplomacy, like a game of chess, where there's a great deal of negotiation and meeting between commanders and so on, Clive breaks all the rules. He attacks at night. He attacks in the middle of thunderstorms. He attacks early in the morning out of the fog. Things that simply were not done at that time. And so this horrible, psychopathic man succeeds in making a whole series of incredible victories, culminating in the Battle of Buxar when he defeats Shah Alam, the Mughal emperor. And this is the last moment the Mughal empire comes together. There is a triple alliance between Mir Qasim, who's the Nawab of Bengal, Shuja ud-Dowlah, who's the incredibly tall Nawab of Awadh, who is said can lift up two of his officers, one in each hand, or cut a head of a buffalo with a single swipe of a sword, and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. And these three declare war on the company and try to oust the company in 1765, but instead they are defeated. It's a very close run thing, but at the end they are defeated. And the company suddenly finds that it's got control of the whole of North India. And it can march wherever it likes. There is no one left to stop it in the north. And very shortly after this, the company begins to asset strip Hindustan. And so thoroughly do they plunder this land that they effectively, and the same analogy is quoted in letter after letter, they murder the goose that lays the golden egg. And in only 7 years from capturing Shah Alam and taking control of North India, North and East India, in 1765, after the Battle of Buxar, only 5 years after that, in 1770, there is the most colossal famine in North India. 1 million Bengalis die in that famine. Not a single famine relief measure is proposed by the company. 1/5 of the population of Bengal dies. And the company maintains its rentals by sending out the sepoys into the villages and hanging anyone who doesn't pay their taxes. So for 2 years, despite the massive death, they succeed in maintaining their profits. And so excited by this are the shareholders in London that in the middle of this famine, they vote themselves an increase in their dividend from 10 to 12.5%. But such brutality, A, cannot be hid, and reports begin to arrive in London about the mass murder going on. And B, the profits cannot be maintained because the Bengalis are starving, the fields are dry, and there's no productivity. So on the third year, 1772, so they managed 1770, they managed 1771, 1772, finally the chickens come home to roost, and the assets of the company in India sink to almost nothing. When this news arrives in London, first one bank, a Scottish bank called the Air Bank, collapses, and when the news of this is heard, 30 more banks collapse across Europe. It's similar to, but much bigger, to the whole subprime collapses 10 years ago. And so what happens? The state intervenes. And because in this case, the East India Company genuinely is too big to fail. And so again, in something that appears very familiar to us, the state intervenes and bails out the failing multinational, which had seemed so powerful and now suddenly is revealed to be so weak. And they go, first they want 50 million, then they want 100 million, and then the government has to recall Parliament, which has been prorogued. They come back, and they vote this enormous loan to the company in return for regulating it. So from that point, the company begins to turn from this sort of unregulated, private, buccaneering company that, in the words of one observer, looked on India as a buccaneer looks on a galleon, merely as a source of plunder, to what becomes increasingly a sort of public-private partnership with the government more and more in control. And so you get this other theme that emerges, this theme which is so important to our own time, which is the power of the state versus the power of the corporation. And this is an intimate dance with varying results decade by decade, and which continues to our own day. You don't have to be a particularly woke anti-globalization reporter to know that historically it is true that corporate lobbying has sunk whole governments in recent times. In 1953, the Anglo-Persian oil company is about to be nationalized by Mossadegh, the democratically elected Iranian leader. The Anglo-Persian oil company intervenes, and there's a joint MI6 CIA coup which brings him down, producing the whole series of messes which are still with us in Iran today. after America and Britain bring down the only democratic government in Iran in modern history. 1955, Guatemala. United Fruit controls 40% of the agricultural land, and a new socialist government wants to redistribute land and reform land holdings. What happens? A CIA coup that gives birth to the phrase Banana Republic. 1977, ITT lobbies the CIA to intervene in Chile with Allende, creating that chain of incredibly right-wing juntas and all those human rights abuses of the late 1970s. And then there's the whole question of ExxonMobil and its influence on the Bush government. Still unclear the extent to which Bush government policy in Iraq was in response or not to corporate lobbying from oil interests. So these are real things, and they continue to be issues today. But their origins can be found in the history of the East India Company, which is why when you read it, you have this whole succession of sort of shivers up your spine when you see happening 200 years ago versions of what happens in our own time. Elizabeth Warren, in her campaign speeches this week, has been talking about the need to regulate powerful corporations. Last year, can you remember when there was that business with Amazon choosing where its new headquarters was going to be? The East India Company, in I think, 1690, pisses off the governor of the Carnatic because they won't pay their taxes and they won't pay him proper respect. So a character called Niccolò Manucci, who's a sort of Italian con man, is sent out, speaks good Persian to negotiate. And he says, well, if you want to bully them, the East India Company can just move elsewhere. We can move our headquarters to Bengal or to Bombay. It's your choice. And so by this threat of moving the headquarters, of defying individual nation states, you get this corporate game of setting up, of getting special tax relief, special treatment. The whole way in which Amazon has evaded paying taxes over most of the world has been through this. In the case of the East India Company, it is ultimately the state which wins. From its first inroads into the company following its bankruptcy in 1772, the state increases its regulation and its oversight of the company until during the Napoleonic Wars, it actually manages to get a governor general who becomes the governor general in India and uses the East India Company armies, the private armies of the East India Company, not to support East India Company trade, but to wage war against the French in India. And this character is Richard Wellesley, and his younger brother is a man called Arthur Wellesley, who later becomes the Duke of Wellington. And these two brothers conquer more of India than Napoleon conquers of Europe. Forgotten really today, Richard Wellesley. People do not remember him. But this is the man who defeats the Marathas. And there's these cataclysmic battles in 1803 with the great Maratha armies, Assaye and Amgaum. And at the end of this, the company marches into Delhi, which previously had been under Maratha governorship, and it takes over. And there sitting is Shah Alam, who had seen Nadir Shah ride in age 12. He's now an old man of 80. He's been blinded by an Afghan former Katamite called Ghulam Qadir, and he's sitting there in his ruined palace, the blind emperor of what is now an illusionary empire. And this is the man who the East India Company takes cynically under its wing and says that it is the protector of it. There is no exact equivalent, thank God, of the East India Company today. Powerful as Google, Facebook, Walmart, ExxonMobil all are. ExxonMobil, if it was a country, would be the 14th richest country in the world, richer than just above Norway. These companies are often much richer than most nation states. But as powerful as they are, while they might lobby governments to bring down other governments, they don't actually claim sovereign rights over whole governments as the East India Company does. The East India Company rules India for 100 years. And no company today does that. Facebook does not have fighter jets. Google may listen to our conversations, but it doesn't have nuclear weapons yet. But this is an ongoing story. It is one of the big stories of modern history. Is it state power that is ultimately going to win, or is it the power of a corporation? And in the long run in human history, who knows who is going to win? The East India Company, the state won. But in the future, with surveillance capitalism, I don't know. The one time the company is put on trial, these are the sepoys, by the way. By this stage, you have these huge regiments of sepoys, all in their different uniforms, these mercenary troops paid for by loans from Indian bankers, and trying to get to. Here's the East India Company flag, looks vaguely familiar. Here's the fancy new headquarters that's built in about 1800. Here's the director's boardroom out of which all these decisions are made. The docks in London that they've built, the incredible, huge shipyards built for the East Indiamen trading tea and opium across the world. This man, Warren Hastings, is the one time that the company's put on trial. In fact, quite typically, they get the wrong guy. Warren Hastings actually is probably about the nicest of all these men. And he speaks Bengali and Persian, translates the Bhagavad Gita, and of all the various people they could have put on trial, they end up putting him on trial. And so he gets off. But when Warren Hastings is on trial, the Lord Chancellor comes to the bar, and I'll just finish today with this little quote, which I think, in a way, sums up. In an age when we have a corporate mogul in the White House, and it's only, 6 weeks since a former director of ExxonMobil was Secretary of State until Rex Tillerson resigned. So the Lord Chancellor steps up at the bar and he says, corporations have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. They therefore do as they like. Thank you very much.
Wasn't that amazing? Absolutely stunning. So, William, at what point of time did the East India companies go from being just a trading company to deciding that they would now wield arms and would arm and create armies? At what point of history did that happen of their?
So there's no one point, because the original charter in 1599 does authorize it to wage war. And a lot of the cost of sending that first expedition to Indonesia is the fact that it has to be an armed expedition. Because in those days, if they run into the Portuguese, it's either one will attack the other. Ditto the Spanish. So there's always the threat of arms, and it's always an armed trading, an armed trade. But the moment, 1765 after Buxar, is the moment that they begin to control great swathes of territory. And that is the moment when they pull off this amazing business model. Because up to this point, throughout history, any European from Roman times who wanted to buy things from India, there were very few things that Europe produced, even in Roman times, that anyone in India wanted to buy. Well, there were always an awful lot of things in India, such as silks and ivory and sandalwood and so on, that Europeans wanted. And you get letters of Pliny writing from imperial Rome, saying, why is it that our rich, beautiful Roman ladies insist on being swathed in silk, rubbed with sandalwood salves, and wearing ivory, lovely things, and diamonds, of course, another unique Indian export, which everyone in Rome wants. And so the East India Company, like all these traders before it, had to send out bullion. They send out gold and silver. And in return, they get these goodies. And that's what the company did. But in 1765, having got this right to the Diwani, the right to run the Mughal finances in eastern India, they no longer have to send any money out at all, because all they do is tax their Indian subjects. And with the profits of the taxes minus the costs of the troops and so on, They then buy goods, which they ship to India. So it's a kind of perfect business model in many ways. If it didn't involve killing the golden goose. They just tax the people they've conquered, buy goods, ship them to Britain. And for about 15 years from 1765, you get these vast sums of money just gushing out of India at a rate of 15 million, 16 million, sometimes 20 million a year. So much so that gold and silver runs out of Bengal, this richest region. And you find the very first historian to describe the effects of colonialism, Ghulam Hussain Khan, who's this incredibly urbane and educated Mughal gentleman, talking about the drain of wealth. And this, and when you go to England and you go to one of these National Trust properties, and you pay your ticket and go and look at this thing, that's where the money's from.
Will you just paint a picture for us? What was Elizabethan England like at that point of time when Clive was in India? And how much of this wealth in that way sort of propelled the Industrial Revolution, or did it?
So Elizabethan and the era of Clive is 200 years apart. The company is founded in 1599, 1600. First expedition is 1602, and the first return journey is 1607. And at that point, Britain is about 3% of world GDP, and India is about 30%. And it is the achievement, if you like, of the company to reverse that. That by 1858, when the company's wound up, India is about 3% of world trade, and Britain is about 30%. What was the second question that Clive?
What was the setting in England at that point of time? And did the wealth that came from India, did that sort of spur the Industrial Revolution as we then saw?
So the wealth from India certainly made Britain a world power and made it very rich. I don't think historians today do believe that it necessarily financed the Industrial Revolution. That is an idea that has been floated in the past, but they're different things. What starts the Industrial Revolution, in a sense, is industrial engineering. The building of the spinning jenny, designing what are they called? Water power and steam power and those sort of things. Because what the East India Company was doing was exporting Indian goods. What happens in the next century is the different thing is that after industrialization, you get the export of British goods to India, where India is used as a captive market. That's a different story. That's not the story of the company. That's what happens in the Raj. It's not a better story, but it's a different one to the East India Company story, which was about getting cheaply the Indian goods to sell.
And what happens to Robert Clive when he gets back? There he is with all of that money. He sails back and...
So Clive is my favorite character in the book, in that he is the perfect villain. He is the kind of Lord Voldemort of the book, and he just like Voldemort. He's a very successful villain. He's very good at what he does, and he comes back from his third time in India with another enormous fortune. But by this stage, the scale of the Bengal famine has been such that the whole public opinion has changed, and people now. There's a play put on in the Haymarket Theatre where Clive is lampooned as Lord Vulture, and his chief justice is known as Justice Braywell, and there's and they become figures of fun and loathing and envy, and it's a mixture of. One of the encouraging things is I was surprised the degree to which the English press of the age do, make a loud clamor about the human rights abuses. This is front page news for a year. Horace Walpole, the Whig diarist, says we have outdone the Spanish in Latin America. We have plundered more than they plundered the Aztecs. They at least had the excuse of religion. We have done it only for profit. And eventually, Clive is put effectively on trial by Parliament. And he is exonerated in the end. Because he makes a spectacular speech. He's a great orator, and he makes this wonderful speech, a completely outrageous speech, where he goes into Parliament and he says, "My lords, I walked into the treasury in Murshidabad. Princes knelt at my feet. Crowns were littered around me. My lords, I am astonished at my own moderation. and he gets the vote. But this amazing speech pulls, and he narrowly, and he goes home that about 4 a.m, a free man. When he could have been taken all as well, but public opinion has totally changed. He gets whistled and jeered in the streets, and plus he's got some horrible gout or something he's brought back from India. He's in huge physical pain, and he cuts his own throat a month later with a blunt paper knife in a water closet in a loo. It's a horrible end. And of course everyone says it's his guilty conscience, that he's murdered so many people, that he's killed so much. But it'd make a great movie.
Karma. Well, so what is it about the English or the Scottish that you said there were 30 people who were sitting in the office that controlled 100 years in, and yet there were these huge legions of people who sort of left Scotland and England and decided to go off to India.
It was never huge legions. It was always very specific. It was, first of all, it should be said that the risks were very great. 3/4 of the writers, as they were called, who went out, never came back. But if they did manage to survive all the things that battles, disease, monsoons, and everything else, they quite often came back with large fortunes. So it was never the upper gentry it was never the lords and ladies who did this. It was always the down at heel or the marginal. And so my family, minor Scots gentry, who always had more aspirations than natural wealth, were exactly the sort of people who joined the company. And so when I give this speech in Britain, what I emphasize is the plunder, because the British haven't come to terms with it. They just don't know. They're not taught. Amazingly, the British Empire is not on the syllabus. You jump from the Tudors to the Nazis, literally. So I always emphasize that, because there's still this lingering idea that the empire was this benign thing where, we went out.
The Raj, we had cucumber sandwiches.
Well, more to the point, we went to build the railways. I have a historian friend who always, in response to that, always has a hashtag on her tweets, which are only a few massacres, and hashtag what about the railways? But when I'm giving the story in India, the bit that I emphasize is an equally uncomfortable thing, which also is not discussed at all in India, which is the question of collaboration. And the fact is that the Mawaris and the other banking families basically consistently supported the company against the Marathas, against Tipu Sultan, and against all the others. And by reforming the land structure, which had previously been in Mughal hands and was very largely owned by the Nawabs and the upper Mughal gentry, and by putting it up for public auction, so that you get the Bengali Hindu Bhadralok coming up, so the Maliks, the Debs, the Tagores, and people like this. The company, not necessarily through deliberate design, but definitely in effect, creates a client class of Bengalis who done well out of this. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was not for all that Clive is a villain, so Siraj-ud-Dowlah is not an attractive character. He's like Uday Hussein in sort of pre-war, pre-9/11 Baghdad. His own cousin writes about him as being a serial bisexual rapist whose favorite weekend activity was to sink ferries in the Ganges and watching people drown. So a lot of people in Bengal make the calculation that the company is the least worst option. And this, again, is something that obviously is not spoken about in India. It is a simple story of perfidious Brits. But again, the reality is there's never more than 2,000 of them. 2,000 British writers borrow money from Marwari bankers and pay to build up an army of 200,000 Indian mercenaries to fight other Indian armies.
Was the rise...
And that's difficult. It's a difficult thing to...
Was the rise of the Zamindar class and the new domination of the Hindu kings against what used to be a very spectacular Muslim rule. Did they sort of, was that part of the sort of British Hindu coming together against?
Yeah. So the Brits create a narrative that exists to this day, that the Muslims are your enemies, they're degenerate, they looted your country, they're foreigners, and you're better off with us. And that is a consistent, it's not always, it isn't so much necessarily even a cynical ploy, it's something the Brits persuade themselves is true. And so you get, for example, the whole project of these two historians, Eliot and Dowson, who produce a 20-volume work, a very useful work, of Muslim records of Muslim rule of India, which sort of deliberately chooses the salacious bits where Hindus are massacred or where temples are destroyed, and this, in a sense, created the whole worldview that now the RSS, the BJP, and so on, and the millions of internet trolls have fed off. And this is a narrative created by the Brits. And it has an element of truth. It is, it's certainly true, for example, that the Mughal Empire, glorious as it was hugely unequal. So while at the same time as India is producing 35% of world GDP, its GDP per head is only just above that of England, which produces 3%. And the GDP per head in Britain overtakes that of India by about 1,800, partly out of the plunder. But it's not an equal society, as India still is. It's a very unequal society. And, whether it's the bankers, the Mawaris, the Banyas, or the Nawabs, not much of this wealth is circulating widely. It's kept in a pretty narrow band of hands.
You talked about the bankers being, the Jagat Seths and everybody who followed thereafter being in control. Nothing much has changed in the world today. Do you see, for example, Goldman Sachs, despite all that happened in the banking crisis, continued to rule the roost? Do you see them to be the prime bedrock on which much of governments sort of create policy or work? Do they control, in a sense, the deep water of government?
It's more complicated than that. It is, as I say, this intimate dance. There are many interest groups out there. And the corporate lobby is a powerful voice and a powerful lobby. But no, I think it would be incorrect to say it is, pulling every puppet string and run. There are many forces at work, many ethnic forces, many lobbying forces, and we live in a complicated world. But certainly it is true that the power of a corporation is very great, that it can be used to lobby, to bribe, to swing public opinion. And this whole question of corporate regulation and controlling, how does the nation state, it's hard enough in America, which has a very strong nation state, a very clear sense of identity, very strong institutions, checks and balances. But, much more so in a country like India, where, with the Congress government two governments ago, clearly there was, a mass plunder of the state, spectrum given away at low rates, the coal scam, and all these other things. And so it's as if you've replaced, what was a sort of crony socialism of the 60s with a crony capitalism
of the present.
Of the present.
On that happy note, any questions? If we can keep the questions really short, and we'll take a couple, because I'm aware that we're running out of time. So,
a quick one: who controlled the conduct of East India Company in England? Was it the Parliament or Board of Directors or something?
Now, the whole point is that initially it wasn't Parliament; it was a company, and frankly, no one controlled the company servants in India, in that it took 9 months to get there and 9 months to get back. So whole wars could be fought and won or lost before you even consulted the directors back home. And you get this continual
Say thank you to you.
the stream of letters coming out from London by the directors saying, we don't want wars. We want just a quiet trade. Your job is to increase the profits, not to conquer territory. But it's in the interest of the guys on the ground to fight these battles, because with a war, the company pays the costs, but if you do capture, say, Tipu's Srirangapatnam in 1799, it is the men on the ground, the soldiers and generals, who divide the plunder. So the company pays the bills, but the guys fighting the battles get the profits.
So that doesn't come back to the company?
It doesn't come back to the company at all. And so, and that's true around the world, that it is the old way, that if a town surrenders, it's allowed to keep its wealth. If it defies an army, it's given up to plunder and it's divided. And there's a straightforward divide at this time where I think a third goes to the commander-in-chief, a third goes to the leading officers, and a third goes to the ordinary troops.
And who appointed the chief of the company? Was it the governor or something?
It's so initially, before it goes bankrupt and begins to be regulated, it's just the shareholders. And you get a board of directors and they vote the
So Google, now that it's conquered, Boulder gets to keep whatever the wealth is here. Pretty cool.
Thank you.
Did the hubris and hegemony and the monopoly of the company make the mutiny inevitable?
So the final act of the company's history is the great 1857 uprising, still called in England the Mutiny, known in India as the First War of Independence. And yes, I mean, it's a mixture of things. It's arrogance, also a new strain of evangelical Christianity, which has come. So you get the generals drilling their sepoys to the Ten Commandments, and collectors putting up biblical readings and sort of thing. And so you get increasingly a conspiracy theory gaining circulation among the company sepoys that they're going to be converted by force to Christianity. And yes, but ultimately it is the arrogance and the misgovernment of the company which leads 3/4 of its own troops to turn their guns. It's not the Marathas, it's not Tipu Sultan, it's not the Mughals that creates the greatest anti-colonial revolt. It's the East India Company's own army which revolts, and 3/4 of them go into revolt, and they very nearly defeat the company, but they don't.
William, what was the role of Shivaji out of Pune and his spiritual and military advisor Ramdas in actually creating all those Hanuman clubs and the army and taking over eventually India from the Muslims?
So he plays a very important role. So Shivaji is the Maratha war leader. He is a contemporary of Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb expands into the Deccan, conquers these two Deccan sultanates, Golconda and Bijapur. Shivaji's father fights for the Bijapur sultans, and that's what brings the two forces into initial contact. Shivaji goes into revolt, defeats the Mughal emperor several times, runs a guerrilla campaign, captures 3 times the Mughal port, Surat, and plunders it. And that leads to a domino effect elsewhere, where the Sikhs rise up in the Punjab, the Jats rise up in the Doab, and the whole thing begins to collapse. But a bigger force is Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah coming in and looting the entire Mughal treasury just is like, a fire extinguisher. It just puts out the fire there and then. But a very, very important figure. And what surprised me was that I'd presumed that Shivaji, who, as you know today, is this sort of godlike figure in Bombay and Maharashtra. I'd presumed that was 19th century nationalism. But you actually get it within about 20 or 30 years of Shivaji's death. You have Maratha accounts comparing him to Lord Ram and so on. Well, Hinduism had never died, but Hindu rule. Hinduism had continued, and the Mughals had been, the great Mughals like Akbar had been extremely tolerant of it. They'd all had Hindu mothers, but not Aurangzeb.
Yeah. By the time Akbar came around, he was 3/4 Hindu.
He was half, and then I think Shah Jahan is 3/4 and Aurangzeb. Yeah.
One at the back.
I had a question about the Dutch company. You mentioned that they were rivals at the early part of your talk. If you had written your book about the Dutch East India Company, would it have been basically the same story, or in some ways different?
A similar story. There's a number of Dutch companies that precede the East India Company. Then the East India Company is formed 1599, which causes all the Dutch companies to come together and form the United Dutch East India Company in 1602. So technically it was formed 3 years after the East India Company, though you can argue it both ways.
We only have time for one more question. You have the microphone.
But yes, similar
because
story.
We'll have to scram out of the library.
Hello.
Hi. In the U.S., there's been a lot of talk of reparations for descendants of Africans that had been enslaved. And in some other countries, Australia, Canada, reparations for indigenous folks. Has there been conversation about reparations for India and Indians, and what does that look like?
There's been talk about reparations for India in India, but incredibly little conversation about it in England, because, as I say, the Brits as a whole just don't know this stuff. And there has been no equivalent of the German education system teaching young Germans today about the Nazis. And most Brits simply aren't aware that their ancestors did anything worse than build a whole load of railways. I mean, genuinely. And it's a problem, because I've been 25 years in Delhi, and you see these bright young ambassadors coming out full of top Oxbridge degrees, brilliant minds, and they all think, wow, we're back in India, old friends, Edwina and Nehru, it's all lovely. And
we gave them English.
We taught them English, we brought the railways, only a few massacres.
Gave them the Cambridge Society and the schools.
And there's simply no understanding in England as a whole that there was any problem. Which is why there's been this daft policy whereby the Queen and David Cameron go to Jallianwala Bagh and then don't apologise. I mean, either don't go if you're not going to apologise, or go and apologise, but don't go and not apologise. So no, and long before we ever get any close to any discussion of reparations, you need a massive education campaign in Britain to teach both sides of the story. I mean, there are things that could be proud about. India in 1947 had the best university system and the best secondary and tertiary education system in Asia. It isn't like it was the plunder of Bengal that you get in the 1760s is not the same situation as 1947. India, there's a million things you can point the finger at the Brits, and Shashi Tharoor does, but it's a more nuanced and black and white picture than the East India Company, where I can see no conceivable justification for what the company did. And the company itself would not have justified it in any other terms than they were there to make a profit. They were a business. Why does anyone join Goldman Sachs? To make a profit. So that the refreshing thing about the company is you don't get any cant about railways. It was understood in Britain in the 17th and 18th century that this was a business going to make a profit. And it's only the Victorians who muddy the water with all this talk of railways and what have you. So the short answer is there's not even a whiff of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, William Dalrymple.